Here is my second try with the video that I'm about to do. Alexander of Macedon by Harold Lamb. I realized I was too tired for it to be a good video and actually deleted content, which is unnormal for me, but if I'm yawning way too much, it's about time to ding and start over, you know. It proved to be not far from Pella, and Philip allowed the other boys, Ptolemy and Nearchus and the rest, to go along with Alexander. Mounted on Bucephalus, Alexander could ride back to Pella in a few hours, and Olympias pretended to be content because, in this matter of schooling, Philip refused in his sober intervals to change his mind. And so that's why we've all heard of Alexander, right? Chapter 2 is called The Riddle of the Earth's Shape. Now, not every faith at the time thought that the world was flat or a hollowed out egg or something like that. Or a bottom half of an egg or something. Some faiths actually taught that the world was not only round, but it's not spheric. It's not a sphere, it's spherical. It's kind of big in the middle, like a particular, like some of the ground bird eggs. I mean, chickens, I guess, don't really quite have that, but there are some eggs that are kind of some animals. The riddle of the Earth's shape. Olympias could change her mind as quickly as she moved her eyes, and since she could not get rid of the Stagirite philosopher and his academia for the boys, she determined to profit by him. From her spies she learnt that Aristotle taught more than medicine and had a flair for politics, that his closest friend was Antipater, the most reliable general on the staff, and that Philip himself often rode in to consult the eccentric philosopher. In fact, Philip had been so eager to get Aristotle near to Pella that he had agreed to pay a great price to rebuild all the homes of Stagura, which had been devastated by a war. Olympias could appreciate the influence. "You are old enough to have a mind of your own," she told Alexander. "Don't waste yourself on medicine. The Stagirite can reveal the secrets of politics and government to you. You ought to be given some authority of your own, especially when Philip's away, hunting or marching most of the time. You should be regent when he's away." Authority given to Alexander would mean more power in the queen's deft hands. Before venturing to visit the new school in Mysa, Olympias, who bothered to read a few books, I'm guessing it's the Omega starting the name, who bothered to read a few books, read the tragedies of Euripides carefully, especially the Metis. It seemed to her that Metis had stood like herself, unaided except by sorcery, except against the strength of men, and she appeared like a living goddess within the temple of the nymphs. Well, certainly a human that fit in with the temple statues is, well, I mean, it's not really the thing to say closer to a god or goddess, but, you know, not any less. When she dismounted from her chariot, her supple body, draped in sheer silk, whipped about her by the wind, the boys stared. Few married women ventured out of doors with face and body so exposed. Alexander did not notice, but Ptolemy observed that the queen brought with her 2 handsome slave girls, who laughed at the gray stone figures of the nymphs standing along the entrance terrace. To Aristotle, who came out perforce to greet her, she differed prettily, saying that she was old-fashioned, as this deserted shrine, being brought up in the mysteries without a notion of silence, and she quoted Andromachus's line, "The only joy of a woman's heart is to have her sorrows ever on her tongue." She left behind her at Mysa the impression that a fascinating woman trusted Aristotle with the future of her only son. To Aristander, the diviner, she confided that this New World philosopher named Aristotle lisped and had nothing really to offer in the way of creative ideas. Probably he owed his reputation, such as it was, to being one of Plato's favored pupils, and to his habit of denying the power of the gods, or, well, what they called gods anyways. The boys at Mysa found the temple and the gardens filled with strange apparata, piles of variegated rocks, collection boxes of shellfish, stuffed birds, insects occupied all the containers, along with furnaces, basins of living fish, books of butterflies, and pressed leaves, as if specimens of all living and growing things had been gathered in. They began the study of medicine by examining the bloodstream in animals and drawing sand charts of human anatomy. Moreover, the Stagirite himself had little to say to them. A staff of assistants worked with them through the endless experimentation that began with the first daylight after Alexander had finished his sacrifice to Zeus. Now, I've said it before, but let me remind you that Zeus does not have to be thought of in these personified terms. In gendered terms, it could be just basically, it's basically a word that can be used for not only a chief deity, but the god itself. But it's been so personified that people usually don't get that part. Same thing with a lot of the Greek names, and there was variation in spiritual beliefs among the people. It was just the common thing was polytheism and personification. The assistants explained that Aristotle worked like that. He would not reason at first, anyways. He would only examine and experiment to determine natural causes, answering the what before the why, and avoiding wondering about the wherefore. In his strange method of taking nothing for granted, it was necessary to learn the causes of sickness before being taught the cures. Not only did the young Macedonians had advanced beyond the study of natural things, could they gain knowledge of phenomena, of the mysteries. Aristotle had a way of dodging talk about the mysteries by saying that life was enough of a mystery for one man's mind. He is a phenomenon himself. Ptolemy complained. He doesn't preach. He doesn't teach. He tells us not to believe what we read, but to ask questions. And we ask questions, he doesn't know the answers. I'm trying to give it a Greek pronunciation, not seeing the Greek characters, but not the Latin pronunciation. There's not with every Y, and The assistant said no. Aristotle had plenty of mysteries tucked away in his head, of which he had worked out the solutions. He simply didn't believe it to be as important to hit on an answer as to be able to work it out. It is like that Gordian knot in the shrine over in Asia. Aristotle would say you couldn't untie it without knowing how it was tied, after finding out that any galley slave could undo it. And did this mean, Ptolemy retorted, that they were expected to work like galley slaves? It seemed so. They might be royal kinsmen, but they were set to sorting out and classifying all the varied species of things, from coral to the constellations of the stars, until they had finished measuring and identifying things. They would not be ready to cope with ideas. Terminology and all that's very important, but it's more than terminology, but you do gotta express things correctly as far as with what one's got. Into this enormous task, Alexander threw himself as if it had been a challenge. It seemed to him that the Greek assistants expected him to fail, and that Aristotle himself was secretly amused by his pupil's clumsy efforts. Alexander resented the silence of the philosopher who would never reveal the mysteries he had ascertained for himself. Only in the end of the day, in the sunset hour, would the Stagirite emerge from his study to walk through the gardens with the boys, glancing at the work they were finishing up. His lined head outthrust, his thoughts seemingly off somewhere in the cloudy horizon, and the first directed question he asked them set off Alexander's quick temper. He wanted to know what they would do if they were caught in a small sailing craft offshore with a storm coming up. Harpalus, the canny peasant's son, said he would knot the sail ropes fast and sail before the wind, holding to the steering oar. Ptolemy would make a quick sacrifice of anything valuable he had to the powers of the sea to secure his life, while Nearchus thought that he would unship the mast, wrap the sail around it, and secured by ropes, and let the boat ride behind this sea anchor until the sudden storm blew itself out. Aristotle turned last to Alexander. "How can I tell you?" the boy burst out. "How can I know until the thing happens?" The Stagirite eyed him thoughtfully for a moment, as if taking notice of him for the first time. "That is well said. It's honest, at least." And he was walking on, dismissing the matter, when Alexander stepped in front of him, angered. "Well, who is right? Ptolemy or Nearchus?" "Well, I'm going to tell you right now, not what the answer in the history and story version is going to tell you. The dude who just assumed, I need to make sacrifices when things are difficult. I just need to pile things on the altar. Does God or any of these deities actually say this? Or are people just assuming I just need to do some crazy level of sacrifice to turn things around? And sacrifice when it's not necessary, just, okay, maybe some prayer or something, and that's it. But who? Aristotle shook his head. Why would it depend on the storm? And only a ship's master could tell you about that. His eyes narrowed, focusing on something. I can only tell you it would be wrong for this cretin de prey, and for Ptolemy, son of Lagus, to try his luck with a sea anchor. The other people's decision, That's begging the question. You're being paid to teach us, not to quibble with words. What is the truth? Does the god Poseidon, I forget what Poseidon means, so I'm not saying whether or not that can be a real name for a god, control the force of the waves, or does the wind blow of its own accord? Either one or the other must be the truth. You can't divide words like a number into smaller parts. Without anger, Aristotle continued to inspect the sunset. When you speak of truth, you mean an idea. An idea can be divided again and again, and down until you reach what is indivisible. When you arrived at the indivisible, Aristotle maintained, you knew that you had come face to face with reality. Until then, you could not be sure. Stubbornly, Alexander stood his ground, certain that truth couldn't be divided up, like a silver drachma. Instead of arguing, the philosopher reached into the nearest specimen case and took out something that proved to be a dried-up crawfish with a tag on it. "What is this?" he asked. "A small crawfish," Yes, Aristotle glanced at the tag, but it happens to be one of the small varieties from the Cyclades Islands. Yet it may be small only because it's half grown, and it may also be found as far away as the Euxine Sea. It is a crustacean and also prototype of land shell animals, a vestige of the earliest life that existed in the waters before land had formed. Then again, it is food for a castaway, a rare seasoned dish for a gourmet, related to a lobster, and in miniature forms, a kind of sea life that gave rise to legends of sea serpents and monsters of the deep seas. Still, as you say, it is indeed a smallish crawfish. He tossed it back and continued his walk along the path in the glow of sunset. When he was out of hearing, Ptolemy laughed. And for this we work like galley slaves. He considered his friend speculatively. What are you, lad? Come now, let us divide the truth. You're Alexander, certainly, and I think nearly full grown. You're the only child of Olympias's womb. Also, the only sane and legitimate offspring of Philip. You're human, judging by the blood that runs out of you. It isn't ichor by any means. Yet, you seem to have a divine spark bequeathed to you by Heracles or Achilles, or at least that's what you think. Tell me, do you breathe ordinary air or heavenly ether? Let's see what else. You're a barbarian youth, trying to master the wisdom of the Greeks. He broke off quickly, aware that Alexander stood rigid and silent, holding in his anger. Since the day when he had nearly died in the sword fight, Ptolemy had been careful not to irritate the single-minded Alexander too far. Look, if you want to find out what this Stagirite believes, pin him down to something. Experiment on him. Show him a verse about Medea safeguarding her lover Jason by magic. Well, there's not a J in. How do you say Jason in Greek? For a second, Ptolemy contemplated Olympias in his role of Medea and added hastily, "You're quite right about one thing. Either the gods exist or they don't. Well, perhaps there's something that exists, but it's not gods. It's a possibility too, isn't it?" That night, Alexander ventured alone into the laboratory, where the students were not allowed after lamplighting. Under his arm, he carried the roll of a manuscript worn with much use, and he found Aristotle busied with the assistants over a furnace into which a copper cauldron had been set, filled with water. They were observing the hot vapor that rushed from the narrow outlet pipe of the cauldron when the water was heated to a high temperature. This vapor generated force enough to turn a heavy wooden wheel, yet the philosophers did not concern themselves with the force within the vapor. They watched it fly up against the cold metal plate hung from the roof. On this plate, the vapor distilled into drops of water that dripped down like rain. In fact, they were making within the laboratory a miniature rainfall. That's terribly destructive to a building, but to the action of this vapor, Aristotle paid close attention. He believed, as the boys knew, that besides the four familiar elements, earth, air, fire, and water, There existed an elementary force. There existed a fifth elementary force in vapor. And there rumbles my stomach again. Aristotle believed that the sun's heat drew vapor from the bodies of water upon the earth's surface, and that this vapor encountered a cold stratum of upper air and condensed into rain or snow, which fell in turn upon mountain summits, feeding the streams that ran into rivers, discharging into the smaller earthbound seas. From these sea waters flowed out through gates like the pillars of Heracles in the west, the vast enveloping body of water embracing the land mass and known as ocean. So, as the flow of blood within the artery sustained life in man, this incessant circulation of water sustained all life throughout the firmament. If this fifth element, vapor, should cease to aid the water flow, rivers and lakes would dry up, and life in its manifold forms, insect, plant, animal, would cease in time. If rain came in this manner from the circulation of moisture, it could not come from the flight of the sons of the north wind across the sky vault, aided by Cyclopean giants who struck thunder from the clouds. For some time the boy watched the drip of artificial rain before Aristotle noticed him. Flushed and holding himself tense against a rebuke, Alexander handed over his manuscript. "Will you note for me," he asked abruptly, "what is wrong in this?" Opening it, the philosopher found it to be a much-worn copy of Homer's Tale of Troy. Without comment, the Stagirite said, "Ask for it again in 3 days, but not in the night study hour." To Alexander's surprise, when he examined Aristotle's annotations upon his prized copy of Homer, he found no questioning of the power of the so-called gods who aided mortals, only correction of some wording and explanation of many puzzling points, so that the lines were easier to read than before. When the boy demanded why he had merely revised the reading instead of getting at the truth of the Iliad, the Stagirite explained that it was rhetoric and not a history, such as the books of Herodotus. Well, Herodotus is a type of history, but there's issues with Herodotus. Let's not pretend otherwise. It's fine work as a poem, and that is far from being a history of natural things. If it were that, for once a smile crossed the lined face of the philosopher, that book has not been written yet. So, at Misa, the boy worked alone, fearful of failing, feeling that the older man had condemned him as stupid. They had no sympathy for the imagining, and he plowed his way through rhetoric, logic, and endless experimentation in their new natural science. And the stomach growls again. He drove himself at this work, determined to find out for himself the truth of the mysteries in which he believed and concerning which Aristotle would not speak. Apparently, Aristotle paid no attention to him, and because he himself worked 16 hours in the day and night, did not realize that his pupil was overtasking both eyes and mind. Carefully, Olympius edged him on, saying that Heracles, his ancestor, had achieved greatness by supernatural labors. That Heracles, his ancestor, had achieved greatness by supernatural labors. When she returned from one of her visits to the Delphic shrine, she was full of gossip that she had heard at the hostel. Fancy, the The people were saying how fortunate are the Macedonians to have Philip for their general and Alexander for their king. How strange that they should mention my darling as king, although you are 16 and past the age when money boys serve as regent. Aristotle must know that. In truth, he is doing more for you in teaching you to live wisely than Philip, who has done nothing for you except to claim you as his son. And I doubt if that's a blessing. Well, obviously Philip's doing more, but Philip's not the best of influences. And perhaps that's why he sent him off, because imperceptibly she changed towards her son when he rode the black horse Bucephalus into the grounds at Pella, where Olympias had to put the finishing touches to the palace buildings. Her servants greeted him with ceremony. She made a point of asking his opinion and showing her dependence on him. Then, when he stayed at night, she took pains to have young Greek-trained prostitutes display themselves where he could not help but notice them in the halls. Alexander, she thought, was old enough to need such girls, and Olympias much preferred that he should avail himself of the handmaids she could keep under observation. But the girls reported to her that he noticed them no more than other household servants, as if they were merely slaves to do Olympias's hair or to anoint her after a bath. Well, perhaps respecting the order of work and not abusing things like the king, who was willing to force anybody that catches his fancy. It troubled Olympias that she could not bind her son closer to her by one of these girls. She scolded them, telling them to use other oils and scents than hers, and that she heard of the fantastic happenings with the naiad in the garden. Now, yeah, it's probably best that sometimes that the women don't quite remind you of your mother so much. You smell like my mom. That could be why he's not interested in them in that way. A gardener's wife related it, frightened as she heard it from her man, who had been at the wheel, who had been at the wheat. It had been unbelievable, as if it were ascending from the powers. In the ancient Egyptian, this is not Greek, obviously, but the ancient Egyptian sort of meant powers. So it went beyond just referencing to what people would worship. Because not everything that people would worship would be considered one of the powers. But at the end of the day, Alexander had been riding headlong as usual from the resistance across the gardens towards Mysa. He had leaped the black horse over a stone wall and had almost run down a strange girl who was carrying grapes in a woven basket on her head. She had her skirt wrapped around her waist, leaving her legs bare, and she was singing. With the grapes flying and crushing, the young lord had bent down to pick the fallen girl in his arms and had swung her up. Her hair spread over him like spun gold threads, waving in the wind. So he had held fast to her, and she had not cried out. Out in the mown wheat, the young lord had stopped the horse and set down this yellow-haired naiad. Set this yellow-haired naiad down, but he had got down himself with his arm around her, and had stayed there with her, pulling his cloak over them in the wheat field until the sunset had dimmed, so that the gardener could see no more. When Alexander had gone off, this unknown girl had wandered back to look for her basket, and when the gardener spoke to her to ask her name, she had not been able to answer in either Macedonian dialect or Greek. So the gardener believed she had been a naiad of the forest, appearing in that hour of the night's beginning, and then returning to her forest haunt. Well, there are spirits that seduce humans, but likely she didn't want to let it be known, that she had the affair that she did, because that's not necessarily but Olympias, who did not believe in forest spirits, who picked a basket of grapes in the out gardens, had inquiries made at first among the servants, and then in the slaves' quarters, for a barbarian girl with ruddy hair, and a Scythian was brought to her, who had been brought recently in the Delian market, who had been bought recently in the Delian market, and set to picking wine grapes, when Olympias discovered that the girl had a shapely body and nice eyes and hair even seen by daylight. She ordered the slave to be taken from Pella at once, and sold in Thebes. She had no intention of sharing Alexander with a mistress who was not one of her own slaves. She was careful to have the Scythian searched before being hurried off, and as she had half expected, a token was found on the barbarian, a silver belt clasped, ornamented with a lion's head, that Olympias herself had given to Alexander. When she threw the clasp into the fire, the girl wept. Now, we see that tradition carried out in the Bible, of that when you when you have an extramarital affair with a girlfriend or a prostitute, it was apparently sort of really the same thing in this culture. One would give them a token, like if they got pregnant, or to pay them something else later, or whatever. After the Scythian had been sent off in a closed cart, Olympias summoned the gardener and the various slaves who had seen the girl, and ordered them to say no word about the presence of the barbarian. If it became known that such a girl had been in Pella, even for a night, they would all be tied to stones and thrown into the lake. On the other hand, Olympias declared that they needed make no secret of the fact that an elfin girl had been seen emerging from the forest the previous evening.